the Toronto Star. I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. They wanted a city built on gigabytes and data. It was touted as being built from the internet up.
The Sidewalk Labs, they want Wi-Fi everywhere, cameras, data collection, tracking every move, heated sidewalks, time constructions, 89% reduction in greenhouse gases.
Today, they pulled the plug. Sidewalk Labs, a division of Alphabet and sister company of Google, has been trying to build the neighborhood of the future on Toronto's Portlands, called Quayside, for the past 2.5 years.
We think it's entirely possible that we can create a new approach to innovative and inclusive growth in Toronto.
What started as an announcement with a ton of fanfare and optimism has resulted in countless criticisms and questions. Now the news broke that the company is pulling up stakes and moving on. To discuss the Sidewalk Labs breaking news development, we are joined by David Ryder, the Star City Hall bureau chief, who, along with his team, has been following this saga since it began. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Richard.
Dave, first, just in case people don't know, what is Sidewalk Labs and what did they want to do on Toronto's waterfront?
Sidewalk Labs is a Manhattan-based urban innovation company, and it was started by Alphabet, so it's a sister company of Google. A guy named Dan Doctoroff, who was a former hedge fund and real estate guy and a former deputy mayor of New York, led it. And it was created to say, hey, there's all these opportunities with housing and self-driving cars, and there's obviously a big business possibility there. They came to Toronto because Waterfront Toronto, which is a government agency that's redeveloping Toronto's waterfront, especially the East Waterfront, had set up a international competition to say, we want to partner, that there's this 12-acre site on the East Waterfront at Queens Quay and Parliament Street, and we're going to redevelop it, and we want to be a high-tech neighborhood. We want to kind of lead the world. And a bunch of companies made pretty serious bids for it. Sidewalk Labs was the winner. So that's how they ended up coming here. And then there's been a long, tortured 2.5-year saga since then.
Today, they announced that they're throwing in the towel.
They're going. They're leaving. They're packing their bag and taking a porter back home.
This is breaking news today. There's been some rumblings and rumors about this coming. What were you hearing?
I was hearing rumblings and rumors. I hadn't heard confirmed. It sounds like Sidewalk officially notified Waterfront Toronto, which is a city, provincial, federal agency, yesterday, and then Mayor John Tory this morning. Even before COVID-19 hit, there was a lot of people saying there's been so many questions about this, from the size of the land that they want, from data privacy, from are they essentially trying to take over municipal governments because they want their own zoning rules. There were so many questions about it, and they, instead of sort of answering them, it seemed like Sidewalk would try and answer them, but it was whack-a-mole. Every time they knocked something down, either a new question popped up or something they had said previously came into question. And then when the pandemic hit, obviously that leaves a big question about real estate prices along with everything else in the world. So I was hearing rumblings that are they going to go? If they were going to go, that this could potentially kind of be the final nail in the Quayside sidewalk coffin. And as it turns out, it sounds like it was.
There's a lot to unpack there. The first thing is just from the statement that I read, and I'm paraphrasing this, but so is it fair to say that one of the main reasons is due to this economic climate and the fact that they think it perhaps too small a site?
I think it is one of the reasons. And I think the pandemic, I'm sure, played a big part of it. I think there's probably a really good argument to make that this was the outcome and that they would walk away sooner or later. I mean, they were originally supposed to have had a deal or not with Waterfront Toronto maybe a year ago. They pushed the deadlines back so far. But the issue with the size is interesting. So originally, there was a big fanfare in October of 2017 when Sidewalk was announced as the winner. Prime Minister Trudeau came. The guy who was then executive chairman of Google came, and it was a big deal. And it was announced for, we're going to do all these interesting things on what is a pretty small former industrial site on the waterfront. But right away, Dan Doctoroff from Sidewalk and others started talking about the possibility of the land beyond that, and that if things go well, maybe we can start looking at the broader Portlands. So the Portlands is 800 acres of former industrial land that is being redeveloped and rehabilitated at huge expense by government in the East Downtown. So it's a huge, potentially valuable site. So then fast forward through the life of the negotiations and the various stages, Sidewalk started saying pretty definitively, we can't do what we want to do on this little site. We've got access to the rest of it. And there was also originally one of the first statements in Dr. Ruff made was, when he was the finances of this deal, is he said it's essentially a real estate deal. So there's always concern that Google wanted to finance its urban innovations, and they were going to be patenting all kinds of things, and this would be a big opportunity essentially on the value of Toronto's real estate market. And this huge there's not many cities where there's a giant downtown swath of land kind of just waiting to be developed. So that grew and grew. It was a big backlash. Last fall, Dr. Ruff and Sidewalk were forced to say, okay, we're going to retreat our plans to this original little 12-acre, 4.8 hectare site, and we'll stick with that. But a lot of people thought they can't do or don't want to do what they're talking about on that one site.
I think this is all about Silicon Valley and trying to do things to scale. Everything's got to be big. And so I think the thing that I remember is in one of their sort of proposals, they really sort of reached out and tried to expand the project, which I think at the time was considered a huge overreach. But if we gave them more land, would they be sticking around?
That is a really difficult question to say. And I think the pandemic throws a question mark on that, like it does on almost everything else in the world. I think the only thing you could say is that if we said they kind of moved the goalposts on how much land they needed. The last one, I think, was 190 acres, what they called an idea zone, that they wouldn't officially be part of Quayside, but it's an area where they and other innovators would come up and do stuff. I think if we had said yes to that, I think there would certainly, the chances of them sticking around would be much greater. But when it became apparent that the governments of the day and the public will was saying, no, like you originally made a deal for this one small site and that's what you got for now, I think that made it much more likely that they were going to leave. The other complicating factor is that, so Waterfront Toronto is equally funded by the city, the province, and the federal government, and they own that little 12-acre site. The 800 acres of Portland is primarily owned by the city of Toronto. And I know there was a lot of opposition with the city of basically saying to Waterfront Toronto, that's not your land. That belongs to the citizens of Toronto, and it's not yours to play around with or put in a poking or to say, like, yeah, we'll give you this if you stick around.
One of the amazing things about this is how politicians' attitudes changed over the time with this project. First, it was obviously feted as a coup for the city, but various levels took issue with it over time. And in particular, I think Doug Ford's government really took it to task for sort of value for money. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, when Sidewalk first came and everybody said Google company, there was huge anticipation among politicians from the Trudeau government, the Kathleen Wynne provincial government of the day, and John Tory's mayoralty, that this was a coup for Toronto, and it sort of signaled that we had arrived on the international stage, especially on the tech front. That kind of got worn out a little bit over time as Sidewalk would sort of say one thing, and then there would be a leak, usually in the Star, saying actually they're looking at doing something else or something that they haven't kind of made public. Then we had in provincial government, and Doug Ford's Conservatives came in and I think took a look at it and probably tested what the public will was. And there was a feeling that the Waterfront Toronto, this government agency at the time, had been maybe working too closely with Sidewalk or trying too hard to help them get the deal that they wanted and not really representing taxpayers the way they should. So there was a change. The chief executive officer was changed. Steve Diamond, who's a prominent real estate developer who was on the Waterfront board, was made chair. And he essentially took over negotiations and signaled a new stage and basically said,
in an open letter, I made it clear that the proposal would not move forward to the next stages of public consultation and formal evaluation without significant realignment on a number of key concerns.
And there was a couple of big changes. One was that's when Google was forced to retreat to the original site. Another was that the original documents and agreements called Sidewalk Labs co-master developer. And that rubs a lot of people the wrong way, including in the Toronto real estate market, who said they're coming in without bringing any land to the table, and suddenly they're called a co-developer of public land. That's a big problem. And then obviously, is this just a land grab trying to squeeze money out of Toronto to kind of fund their innovation projects? So I think we saw a big change, and I think that change made it more likely to get to where we are today, where Sidewalk said, we're essentially not getting everything we want, and this deal doesn't work anymore.
It really feels like a stunning end to the whole Google coming in and building a city up from the internet, which they like to say at the beginning. If you could point to anything, what do you think was their flaw? Was it their inability to work with all the bureaucrats at every level involved with this and actually work with city-level government?
I think there's a couple of things. I think you touched on it with the size of the project. And I think what that came in was, as far as I can tell, although the initial site was 12 acres at the beginning, that there was always some understanding or some knowledge from Sidewalk and Waterfront that really there was going to be a lot more at play. And that made it kind of inevitable that people were going to say, like, what's really going on here? The other thing I think is you had New York executives who went out of their way to say that they were coming in humble, they were going to learn about the city. Dan Doctoroff made it a common thing that he's been learning how to say Toronto without pronouncing the second T, and he would do it very consciously. But it's hard for them to understand the local context. And one example would be when the data privacy issue first blew up, I know that one of the issues raised was, where is the information for this Toronto neighborhood? Where are the servers going to be? Are they going to be in the United States or they're going to be in Canada? That completely flummoxed and blindsided the American executives. They just didn't get that. Nobody really understood what that, whereas Canadians growing up here with America next to us, branch plan economy, yada, 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 that seems like a pretty sensible question. So I think there was just always a feeling among a lot of people, including a lot of people who originally supported it and still support the idea of having kind of innovation neighborhood, that it wasn't quite as it seemed. And I'll tell you one quick story. About halfway through this saga, I did a story. Basically, Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto had signed the first kind of major agreement on the way to a final deal. It was called a framework agreement. So I covered the board meeting, and at the end of it, they said, okay, we're signed it. And I said, okay, I want a copy. And they said, no. And I was like, what? It's a public document. And they said, no, we've agreed to keep it secret. So I wrote a story about that. And the next few days, I was ironing or something in the morning, getting ready for work. Dan on a local morning TV show. He'd come back to do some media. And the anchor said, she was asking questions about it. And she said something like, I understand that there's some document that's being kept secret. And Dan Doctoroff could have said, well, there is an agreement, but it's not that important, or it's going to be made public eventually, which it was. Instead, he said, oh, if you look at our website, there's all kinds of documents there. No, that's not a thing. Like, there's all kinds of information. You can see that. Banking on the fact that she wouldn't really understand what the framework agreement was or anything. And she was just like, oh, okay. And she went on to the next question. And I just remember watching that and thinking, oh, okay. So this is kind of a different deal than maybe a lot of us thought we were going into. And I think that kind of feeling that it was never quite as it seemed is one of the things that helped doom it.
I used to be a tech reporter, and in that industry, something being killed by Google is definitely a thing. I mean, the company is a bit like a fickle child in that it kills projects all the time. And this was something that critics always knew could be a possibility. But why is this still a surprise?
Yeah, it's funny. And the other thing that could be like, Sidewalk Labs is such a huge thing in Toronto, and it's obviously watched around the world in tech. But for Google itself, like for Alphabet, the parent company, this is not the biggest play that they're making, right? For them, this was, from what I gather, this was kind of a small, interesting innovation offshoot that has some, and I think still has some really promising revenue streams for them. But for us, it's a way bigger decision than it is for Alphabet. You know, for Toronto, it seems like it is big news. But yeah, you're right. For the tech industry and for Google/Alphabet, this is not the biggest news in the world.
I think Google used to classify these things as moonshots. They're ideas that they want to try and work on and obviously create a better society. And, you know, it's funny. It's one of these things. I did think that they had some neat ideas. I always thought the raincoats over buildings were really stupid. I mean, can't they just Google the word awning? But I do think that the heated sidewalks could be something that I'd be very down with. Do you think they had any ideas that we might actually miss?
Yeah, but I'll preface that there's nothing that says the next company coming in can't build on some of the ideas. I mean, there's probably intellectual property ideas and reasons they can't do it exactly the same, but a lot of those things were already out there, and the Sidewalk was just kind of putting their own stamp on it. So one of the big things was the use of tall timber. They had said that steel and concrete is expensive and it's not very good environmentally. So there's a big innovation around the world to try and use wood composite. So that's timber mixed with resins and all kinds of things to make it stronger and to be able to build taller than 6 stories, which is usually about as tall as those kind of wooden towers go. That could well happen. The idea was they would innovate it there and they would actually start manufacturing somewhere on the East Waterfront. There's nothing that says that can't happen. And you mentioned the raincoats on buildings. When I read that, I remember thinking like, okay, somebody is smart there because they've said to Canadians, we can make winter essentially go away in a neighborhood. And most people are going to be like, wow, I'm in. Like, no matter what it takes, if they can heat the sidewalk and make the cold winter wind go away, and I can walk outside and be happy, like that's a huge thing. There is probably something with the heated sidewalks. So I think they're going to take these ideas and these innovations and they're going to try them elsewhere. I mean, a lot of this, there was the flashy stuff that was kind of like that about like getting rid of winter and tall timber and sensors that would make self-driving cars go around the area seamlessly. They were doing a lot of patents for things like if we essentially control a neighborhood, medical records are going to pass through our sensors at some point. How can we give medical companies profiles and people, we can monetize that? There is a lot of actually pretty smart things that I think Sidewalk in some fashion, in some place, some of those will probably come to reality. Whether or not they will end up being part of our development, who knows? But I think there are, among all the kind of mistakes and gaffes and things that blew up, there were a lot of really smart people hired to work on really interesting things. And a lot of it made sense, at least on some gut level. So I would be shocked if some of those things don't end up coming a reality in that area with whatever new partner comes into this.
So that's what Sidewalk Labs might be doing in the future. More importantly, what do you think is going to happen with that stretch of the waterfront?
Well, I think there's going to be a pause. Obviously, this was kind of a traumatic experience for lots of people. I think we will see basically the 3 levels of government. So that's the city, the province, and the feds get together, and they all have members on the waterfront board and say, where do we want to go with this? The most likely thing is a restart and a reset to the international competition to say, look for an international partner to come in and do something on that site. But I think you're going to have a lot of lessons learned. And the RFP, the request for proposal that goes out, is going to be a lot more specific and a lot more rigid than what I think was kind of a free-flowing kind of like, hey, tell us what you can do, and then we'll start trying to make a deal. The original one that went out that ended up with Sidewalk Labs here. Both the mayor and Joe Cressy, who's on the waterfront board this morning, said very definitively, we still want to do this, but we're just going to do it with somebody else, and hopefully in a somewhat different way.
Dave, that's been amazing for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
Yeah, I think Toronto craves the world stage, and then we can be kind of scared when we get it. But I think people should feel good in a way, and that we learned a lot, both about tech, but also about civic governance, and digital data questions that had never been answered before were addressed, and all sorts of issues raised. A lot of activists who said, we know it's an uphill fight against Google, but we're going to try it. They feel like democracy ended up winning. And I think at the end of the day, this puts Toronto in a better position to do something good and that makes sense on the East Waterfront, which is a huge gem. It's a huge asset. I think the question mark now is how we recover from COVID, but every city is involved with that. But I think it was a painful birth. Some people would call it a miscarriage, but at the end of the day, Toronto learned a lot and will be better for the experience when we try it again.
Dave, thank you so much.
Anytime.
David Ryder is the Toronto City Hall Bureau Chief. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raji Mudder, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.